topic matter, understanding performance gaps in racing, an exploration for future development. Delighted to have a really strong panel with us. Tom, you haven't met my inner geek, but it is pretty excited for today. So you might get to meet it. It's definitely a meeting of minds. So I look forward to a really interactive forum. If I could just ask everyone in the room, bar the panel and myself, just to mute mics, please, and kill your video, just for the benefit of keeping the call nice and smooth on the bandwidth so the panel can interact. We'll use the chat forum, which Sid and myself will be across, feeding in questions as we go, and I'll be cornering the last sort of 10, 15 minutes to really field some good questions to the panel. We've got a bit of slalom representation, a bit of physical preparation specialist representation, and really delighted to have Jon here as well, looking at it from the athlete side and someone who's now stepped into a leadership role within one of our home nations. So I'm going to go to the panel just for brief introductions. So I'll kick off with you, Mark.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Mark Ratcliffe, head coach for the slalom program. I've been a coach for about 15 years now, working through, I guess, all ages of the pathway. But probably my insights today are a bit more probably reflective of the senior end, working with senior athletes the last probably 4 to 8 years.
Brilliant, thank you, Mark. And Jon?
Yeah, Jon Scofield here. Nice to see you all on the call, and thanks for the invite. It should be a fun discussion. So I've had 25 years of paddling so far, and 12 years on the program, performance program as a sprint athlete. Initial kind of intro to paddle sports beyond just messing around was wild water racing. So spent up until about 2006-07 racing as fast as I could down rivers and ignoring any gates that might have been getting in the way. Switched over 2007 to the sprint side of things, and then that was me pretty much up until my retirement from paddling this time last year, actually. Recently taken up the role as head of performance and pathways at the Scottish Canoe Association. So I've basically got the responsibility there for just managing our coaching teams and squads across slalom and sprint. Outside of the paddling side of things, I've got a little bit of a science background, completed a master's in human performance, so applied physiology and biomechanics, and was until I took on this job working towards my PhD in biomechanics, which is something I got an eye on getting back to in the future. So yeah, that's me.
Brilliant, thank you, Jon. I'll interject before I go to Tom, because I am conscious of the high intelligence levels on the panel today, so would encourage us, certainly for my benefit, to keep the language accessible where possible in terms of its scientific nature. Tom Hull, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Craig alluded to, my job title is a performance preparation, physical preparation specialist. Let me get that right. But I'm predominantly a strength conditioning coach, and I've spent, I guess, 10 years working in Olympic sports across quite a wide range initially, but have spent the last six and a bit years in the canoeing family. Was working in sprint up until and just after the Rio Olympics, and then transitioned across to the slalom side. And just started my 4th season with the slalom lot. And I guess in addition to strength conditioning, my role takes into account other aspects of physicality and working with the coaches, particularly around planning, and as well as part of my role, but I also have a keen interest in understanding how to break down sports and understanding what can make an athlete successful. So yeah, the topic lines up well.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone. I think, as you can see from the panel, there's a lot of experience within the performance end of sport, perhaps to the upper performance end of sport as well. We're not making apologies for that, but we are conscious of that, and we will look throughout the call as we interact to cross-check to what that means for pathway development. And please do help us with that in the questions to represent that end of the pathway and how performance gaps look from that end of development. Tom, I'm going to stick with you. I think bearing in mind the title, performance gaps, what do we mean by that today?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting what you raise around the level of the pathway. I think it's an idea that can be used at any point. It's not by no means exclusive to the top end. I guess in the simplest form, the performance gap is the difference between your current performance level and the performance level that you would like to achieve. And so you can apply that, like I say, at any level, whether that's the desired performance is winning Olympic gold, or if it's just progressing through the divisions as a developmental paddler. So it can be very versatile, and equally it could match to my own personal running experiences, for example. I think the key thing in the process, though, the performance gap is relatively obvious in the first sense, whether it's a time or some other, like a direct measurement between where you are and where you want to be, which is the first thing to identify. But the real key is kind of digging down below just the obvious, and I guess asking why that gap's there and what underpins, what are the various attributes, qualities, skills that underpin closing that gap. And the key to understanding those is how to close that gap. And like I say, it's very much a thought process which can be applied at any level, with your resources and time flexible depending on what you have available.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. Just to paraphrase that for understanding of everyone on the call. So we're seeing performance gap in terms of a gap from where we are to where we want to be, and however that might shape itself for the individual or the coach athlete cell or the team around an athlete at any one point. I'm going to jump in. We're going to keep this fluid, guys. So please bounce between yourselves. I'm going to start with Mark. I guess, Mark, you've worked with athletes through to junior teams, to age group medals, right through to world and Olympic medals. I guess really keen from the coaching aspect to hear from you when observing performance with a review of then reflecting on it for what it means for development. Where do you start?
Well, such a big area. I can only echo what Tom said there, really. The what is the easy bit, the how is the difficult bit, and how you translate it. And I guess really I try and think of it as the answers in the performance. And it's quite easy to think of general things an athlete needs to develop, but I think if you can always bring it back to the performance, you should be able to see it in that performance, whether it be breaking down the little components, the physical, technical, mental aspects. You should be able to find that in the performance. But for me, it's what do we mean by a performance gap a little bit, because I guess how you identify it is then determined by what you do about it. So what I mean by that is sometimes it can be a mistake that's happened on the day, but it might not necessarily be a performance gap that you need to address over time. It could be to do with the execution on the day. So it's really peeling back as to what we mean by the performance gap. And really that comes down to, is that evidenced all the time, I would say. So would you see that mistake or that performance gap happening over a period of time? Then you've got a bit more context to work with as to how you develop that with an athlete.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So I think that's really key. So what sort of time period in your experience would you use to distinguish the difference between a mistake and maybe a trend of performance?
So I think, as a coach, you work annually quite a lot with the competition season. So I'd very much spend a lot more time at the end of season or sort of mid-season breaking down performance gaps that have happened over time. So you're starting to see a pattern of, is this what I'm seeing reflective of a number of performances? And you'd spend a lot more time, or I would, doing that at the end of the season, so that when you have competitions in the following season, you're referring back to, does that make sense with what I've analysed? Is this common, or is this something new? So you should always have a reference point with that athlete, really, as to what you're trying to do with them and what's happened previously, to then work with anything that's new.
So I was I really like the idea there when Mark draws on it being a process, because I really see it being grounded in learning. And so the two key sources of kind of evolution over time are your knowledge of the event, what you're trying to do, and then the knowledge of your paddlers, and that evolves over time. There isn't a there isn't a defined template that we're necessarily working to. There isn't the perfect picture that we're moving towards. Obviously, that varies a bit depending on the event, but particularly in slalom, there's many ways to reach a similar performance outcome. And so as long as you're clear and you're learning along the way, and at those touch points where, like Mark mentions, at times of the year, there's more focused reflection on these things, but then also understanding how you learn about your athletes as you go through the training process can be equally valuable, and then the two together build over time.
Thank you, Tom. I'm dying to hear from an athlete perspective, having heard the coach and the physiologist speak there, where Jon stands on this one.
No, it's really interesting. I like how you're that simple definition of the performance gap, looking to where you are to where you want to be. I guess one point is I always think about performance gaps kind of in two different ways. What one is that, so that's almost like essentially that linear kind of gap that we're talking about. Is just you want to be here. If you do this time, you're done, and that might just creep over a period of time. The target might get harder and harder, or you might be changing, category or division. The other way I kind of think of performance gaps is the how you were talking about, and I always have a visualization in my head of you might have the total, almost the complete athlete will be almost kind of bulletproof athlete at the end of the day that has all the components that are necessary for the best performance, and that's maybe a sphere and it has no gaps in it. I think about the second way I'm thinking about performance gaps is it's all the bits that make up that athlete that are non-linear, and that you might be able to achieve a certain level on that kind of linear scale towards your performance with different ones missing. But you might get to a point where you're progressing forwards quite nicely, but you've forgotten a little bit of armor that you've never considered that's around the back, that's something you're able to ignore for a long time. So I kind of always have those two things in mind. There's the simple, how many seconds off the performance that I want to achieve am I, but then also where are the gaps in my personal skill set as an athlete. I'll stop blathering in a second, but I was going to draw back to the point Tom had made about it not necessarily being a concept that's that specific to age and stage, really. I'm just thinking back to how early in my career was this concept introduced, and it was right at the start. It's not hard for a kid to understand if their coach kind of looks at some results, says, look, you're 30, 40 seconds behind this person. If you want to improve, that's what we need to take off to achieve this result that you're talking about. So therefore, you might need to be this many seconds faster on this shorter effort, or you might need to think about X, Y, and Z. Those were things that I think come into decent coach-athlete relationships right at the start of a career, and then they're just much more nuanced, and those gaps are maybe a little bit harder to find when you're towards the top end of your sport, but the process is the same.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Jon. I think you've just invented the phrase translinear there, which is a new one to me. I think you can copyright that in the realms of academia.
We'll take that
from here. Jon, I guess I'm really keen to probe that. Like, how do you make sense of a world where you've got this sense of linearity, I want to get from A to B, but you're aware of the complexities of the human body, the environment? How, when you're planning as an athlete with your coach, do you go about sort of the balance of the two and where to put the attention at what time?
So for me, it's grounded in kind of a coach and an athlete working around a scientific process. By that, I mean you are going to, throughout your training, you're going to make hypotheses, which is just a fancy word for ideas. You're then going to make a change based on that idea. You're going to observe the impact of that change, and then you're going to come to a conclusion as to whether that's something you're going to carry on with, kind of go back to what you were doing before, or try something else. Many coaches work through that without thinking it being scientific at all. One of the prerequisites to be able to do that, though, is to not change too many things at any one time. So in terms of, thinking about scientific variables, if you didn't control a lot of the variables, you'd never know if the thing you were investigating, you would never be isolating its impact. The coaches I've seen do this best, they change a limited number of things to address either that gap in the athlete's toolkit, and to narrow down the gap to performance. They give it a decent period of time to be able to assess either the consistency of the performances that you're seeing, or to be in line with a realistic kind of adaptation period based on the attribute that you're trying to change. And then you're in a simple position where you can kind of isolate the impact of that element on the performance gap. So it's simplicity to me, and it's resisting the urge to change something based on every single good idea that comes flying by. So the coach really has to be a filter.
Mate, just coming in on that, John, it makes a lot of sense. And working with the top athlete, like you said earlier, they're pretty rounded in a lot of the areas, and a lot of the areas are to the higher level, and it becomes really challenging as a coach to analyze performance, to find gaps, when a lot of the time it comes down to execution on the day. And you have to really work hard for those one or two things that you might then pursue for that next year or longer period of time. And the harder challenge a little bit when a developing athlete, there can be lots of gaps, and the challenge is to what do you tackle when in the long-term development of that athlete. And just reflecting back, I think the process is still actually the same. A lot of the questions you would ask is almost having that sort of broader, longer-term view as to how you tackle those gaps in order a little bit, because one would affect another. So, for example, in our sport, the ability to execute something skill-wise, could be heavily influenced by the physical development. So it's kind of what gap do you address in what order a lot of the time. But I still think you can apply a similar philosophy, and not too many changes at once. One or two things at a time. Actually makes it quite easy for the athlete then to sort of pursue it.
What would be, do you have kind of any good examples or methods for essentially prioritization of what you're going to approach and when?
I guess recent reflections. I mean, we're very, very technical sport, and a lot of the physical, mental qualities they've built up over a long period of time. You're sort of touching around the edges of, and the technical side always ends up becoming quite a big priority in how we look to improve bits of performance. I guess you're always matching that against that athlete's model of performance, because in our sport you can come at that from very many different ways. As soon as you start looking at another athlete and how they've done it, you have to understand, does that match with what this athlete, how they would go about it, and then make a decision based on that. So there's understanding that the athlete's way of paddling, their performance, and the individuals you're looking at to compare against. But I'd say generally bring it back to the technical side in what we pick up, and focus on one or two areas at a time.
Thank you, guys. Some nuggets there. I'm particularly liking John's one thing at a time simplicity. I can speak for myself, and it's quite a creative mind who struggles then to follow things through, and Tom will be laughing through his beard in the background here. That sense of changing things incrementally and with simplicity, so you can actually judge the effect of the change in a valid way. I think that's really clear. And then hearing from Mark, I guess reinforcing the point of Tom, that the knowledge of the event balanced with the knowledge of the paddler, and how they will apply to the event. So it's like expertise and knowledge of the actual event is one thing, but until there's that sense of craft of the coach of being able to apply it to a person and bring it back, it's not really as useful as it could ever be. Tom, I'm going to jump to you and try and answer Gareth's question at the same time, which is a little bit around athlete motivation. So Tom, you're primarily, as you said, working in the field of strength and conditioning, yet I know you do have a very close role in the identification of performance gaps. I guess as someone removed from the sort of coach-athlete relationship, perhaps seeing the athletes a little bit less, what's your role in how you identify performance gaps and how you can influence athlete motivation from a slightly more removed position?
Always, I think I mentioned earlier, place a very high value on learning, and see that as the gold standard. I don't have a preset agenda as to where I want to take athletes as a strength coach. We have some understandings around the sport. Strength is generally useful to help physical performance, but understanding how to best apply that, there isn't necessarily a right way to do that. But I think in stepping into this situation, is particularly about listening as well. So whether it's explicitly or implicitly, I tend to believe that athletes and coaches between them will do have an understanding of where the gaps are. That may not necessarily always be able to be supplied in the answer to the question, what are the performance gaps? But through conversation or through questioning, through talking through and understanding scenarios about where athletes have been more successful and haven't been more successful, and understanding themselves, that can often tease out some nuggets of understanding about how an athlete needs to improve. And then I think taking those efforts to really understand and I guess integrate with what the coach and the athlete are trying to achieve, I feel often that
just have a reminder for anyone not on the panel just to turn their mics off. Would be much appreciated. Thank you, Adrian.
I find that often by closely aligning whatever support or advice that I would give with what I've kind of worked on with the coach and athletes wanting to achieve, that quite often that motivation's reasonably self-generating, because I'm not trying to take an athlete in a different direction, so I need to motivate them to go somewhere different. I'm contributing to the collective effort of the coach and the athlete. And so whilst that does still need motivation and encouragement through tough times, and physical training can at times feel a bit different to what you're actually working on, by closely aligning what we're trying to achieve physically with what we're trying to achieve globally, then the kind of whole train moves together.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Yeah,
there's a great general point there, isn't there, about never compartmentalizing elements that contribute towards performance. I guess I saw a good example of that. So we probably didn't say, but I was one of the athletes that Tom did his best to try and work with on the sprint side of things. Came in, must have been 2015. I guess we were essentially identifying a bit of a performance gap in terms of overall force production and strength within the squad. And it was actually probably a way of coming up performance gaps that we've not mentioned, is that something that wasn't a gap can become one. So actually we weren't getting weaker, we just weren't getting as much stronger as we thought we needed to for where the event was going to go to, or to the same rate as we were still able to kind of improve some other parameters. So it was a conversation with our coach and Tom that led to Tom working with us. But the key thing there, from my point of view, Tom, was that even though you were another practitioner kind of contributing to the process, it was very much you were only doing stuff that really aligned with everything else we were doing in our training, rather than, as Tom says, coming at it, well, this is my method, you work with me, this is what I'll do. It was very much the opposite of that.
Yeah, I remember it well. We were having a coffee down at Dorney, and I think it was on the Thursday, and Alex, Johnny's coach at the time, was, we'll start on Monday. Can you do 10 gym sessions a week, please? And we'll crack on. And this, I don't think I'd ever done more than 4 or 5 a week with an athlete I'd worked with, but it was obviously a calculated move to a certain extent. So I bought what I believed as to be good practice for developing strength, and then started to use it within the framework that those guys were using at the time, which happened to be 10 times a week.
Brilliant. I think what we've heard there, to link from athlete motivation last week, we've obviously been through coach-athlete relationships, that sense of understanding self and others and how you collaborate and co-create training plans, goals, performances, that sense of openness as well. And I think what Tom describes there is not coming in and looking to change too much too soon, actually observing what is happening and then building rapport and co-creation to maybe try things that are different, not necessarily trying to do things better, just trying things that are different and small things build time. I'm keen to pick up on Jon's point of the risk of compartmentalizing, and I'm going to go to Mark for this due to what I infer to be the complex nature of canoe slalom. I guess when you break down the performance, Mark, what are the benefits and risks of isolating factors to then take away and train and trying to bring them back to the whole performance?
It's understanding the context. So it's easy kind of to identify what's gone wrong in a performance. You know, you can look at they've made a mistake on a particular move. But there's a lot in how you analyze the reasons for it. You know, so you just talked about coach-athlete relationship, the communication, and link that to both the coach and the athlete's general understanding of themselves and the sport. And it's about that conversation, that analysis to find the accurate reason for an error. You know, in slalom, you've got the tactical aspects, you've got the mental aspects of, you know, their sort of emotional side to perform and execute. You've got the physical ability to execute the skills as well as their general skill level. You're trying to navigate conversations around those things to what they planned on the day, is to understand why a mistake occurred and is that a common performance gap. And that comes down to the skill of the conversation and the way that you would analyze it. And quite often you can, if you don't go through that process well, you can end up focusing on the wrong thing that caused the mistake in the first place. You know, in that, you know, for what you might have seen as, I don't know, a planning error or something like that, the athlete might have experienced something in the run completely different than what you would know. Unless you have that conversation, you don't find that out. So I think that's the heart of it, having a really good review process in how you look at the athlete's performance to guide you into the right area. And then you're assessing that, is that common over time as a performance gap, something that we would recognize for that athlete? And then you would obviously work at it that way. So I think, you know, being really accurate at how you identify the gaps, I think it's really important in that process.
So I was going to add to that. I think I completely agree that, I guess, you don't want to. You need to understand how everything interacts together in the process of breaking down the performance, and not going too early. But I think one contingent on that process having been done well, I then think at times it can be then appropriate to focus in quite a lot in terms of how you close performance gaps. So, for example, if you have worked out that strength is an important factor in your performance, then rather than kind of going half and you really want to change it, then rather than kind of I guess having a compromised profile of training where you might do 1 or 2 gym sessions a week, but I will do a little bit of strength, I would generally advocate for putting more effort into something. If you're confident it needs to change, make a change in it, and then you go back and plug it into the overall performance perspective and almost reevaluate that. And I think that's the key learning cycle in these things, because, and Johnny made the point earlier around, I guess, using although you may not, using a bit of the philosophy, I guess, sort of science in that you're testing out ideas. The other key thing there, I think, is being happy you don't know. Because quite often, and I'll say that a lot, is kind of an athlete will ask me about how many gym sessions do I do a week, or do I need to get fitter, do I need to get stronger? But well, I don't know. You usually ask why they've asked me that question, what's led them to that feeling. So it's trying to understand the previous analysis performance. And then it's a case of, well, let's try it. Let's get you fitter or stronger. Try and perform again, see if you get a change. And then if you do get a change, then you can make a reasonable judgment that you had your performance gap identification correct. Then you can take that learning and build it into your kind of your understanding of that athlete in themselves.
Yeah, I said that a hypothesis was an idea, but it's actually more of a guess. Or what you're saying is you got to be ready to guess wrong.
Yeah.
Love that concept of guessing wrong. That's going to make the show notes, I think, there, Jon. You're on fire today. Translinear, guessing wrong.
The catchphrases. But I think the common thing to compartmentalize in my opinion, with approaching these things is the psychological from the physical. And I think that's kind of what Mark was kind of talking around, is particularly evident in slalom, where the psychological approach to it is such a massive component that you've got to be pretty sure, and you've got to observe things over time to see, is someone hitting a gate? Because actually, no matter how good their planning is, or their ability to execute it, or their ability to stay strong on the day mentally, if they don't have X level of strength, then that mistake's probably going to happen X number of times out of 10. The point I was going to make is, unless you're recording the whole picture, you wouldn't know if the athlete wasn't strong enough. And if you didn't know the athlete well, you wouldn't know if there was maybe the issue might have been one that's better approached with kind of psychological tools. And it's also not always a one or the other, but I agree with Tom that generally when you're addressing them is focusing on one thing and doing it well as that being able to control your ability to test whether that works. It lets you put the time and the energy into the thing to change it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jon. What really stood out from Mark's comment to me is that the sense of understanding of performance as a coach, and the need to understand in performance, which is really in the eye of the athlete. That sense of what actually happened in the run, in the moment. Where was my mind? Where was my attention? Where was my focus? How was my body feeling? All those things. And I guess the topics over recent weeks have threaded really nicely to see and suggest that the role of the coach, from Danielle's words the other week, is really to foster a sense of connection with self. How skilled our coaches and practitioners at being able to elicit information through relationships and through questions that help the learner learn about themselves, that sense of learning to learn about themselves. So you get that eye line from behind the athlete's eyes of the performance itself, and it helps you co-create a performance gap solution and work together on it. I think that's really key, because we can't pretend to know, and I love that sense of vulnerability of Tom. I don't know, but I'm willing to find out. Would you like to go on a journey together? And trying to find out a little bit more on that. Tom, I know in prep for the session, and you've talked about it today, that sense of guessing wrong from as Jon puts it. How have mistakes inform process over time?
I think I think you generally always. I think it's a good rule of life. If nothing else, you generally learn better when things go wrong. It's learning from success is actually quite hard to do, because you kind of lose your purchase and your reference point. Whereas something goes wrong, that's a golden opportunity, because there's some certainty in that. Something within what's happened has led to an unsuccessful outcome. So I guess being ready and willing to learn when the opportunity presents itself, I think is really important, and that is helped by let's going back to the hypothesis point is by starting out with clear intent. So if you start out with a piece of training, you have an idea about what you're trying to achieve, and you have an idea of the gap in your performance you're trying to fill. Then you've already set yourself up well to then reflect at the end as to whether did you make the change that you were looking for? Did you learn the new skill? Did you learn the new or physical skill or mental skill? Did you develop a new physical attribute? And then was it successfully deployed in improving your performance in the way that you desired? And I think that that's the crux process. I think what is a key part, which I don't know if sometimes doesn't always get spoken about, is the expert opinion. And I think we can gather data, we can draw down information, whatever we want, but ultimately, as kind of practitioners in applied, for myself in applied sports science or in elite sport, it comes down to expert judgment, and we're just trying to draw information together to make the right decisions at the right time, and as it place confidence in ourselves to do that, but that's counterbalanced by the learning process.
Thank you, Tom. That sense of plan, do, review, and a continuous loop really comes across as an iterative process there, from learning from mistakes and doing that together.
Just to go on that one very briefly, yeah, I think the learning's only captured when the debrief's done well. It's back to what I was saying earlier about, you know, the process to identify accurately what's going on, and the process of debriefing really well is the way that you capitalise on the learning and the mistakes, like Tom said. Because it's easy to go off on tangents from the wrong conclusions at times, that can be counterproductive. So doing that process really, really well. And that just makes me think with the sort of the balance between what you see and your coaching intuition, if you like, that's built up from experience and working with athletes over time, versus that sense check against what the athlete thinks, but what evidence might say that you could put around it that helps you then form that judgment. You know, I think I would, you know, very much from experience, trust your intuition, because you are working with people every day and you build up that experience of all those different components that the athlete's demonstrating every day. But always have that bit of sense check against what the athlete thinks, what evidence you have that might help paint the picture for you. And then you can come to a really good conclusion on what gaps you're looking to fill.
Yeah, I like
Thank
that.
you, Mark.
I like that, Mark. It's kind of it's reflecting the skill that you can have as a coach. And I think in today's age that's developing ever more sophisticated tools, there can be a perception that some of those are going to come in and deliver some of the answers, where they can only do what you described as being some of the supplemental information to your, what you called intuition. But I think I made this point on another call recently, is that when you're using your intuition, you're using the full sum of a human being. That's, you know, that's a lot of processing power. That's a lot of sources of data that you're drawing on, loads of knowledge of who is the athlete in front of you there and then. There's a tendency, in order to sell equipment and devices and tools, to say that you need these to deliver your insight, but a lot of your insight is coming from your what you're calling intuition as a coach, and I'd massively back that up. And the good news of that to a lot of the coaches on the call here is that you've got what you need already. You've got two people, a coach and an athlete, and the ability to talk. Other stuff on top of that will always be supplemental.
The evidence side is interesting, because I've had it the other way, where evidence has guided something I haven't thought of, which is really valuable, because it's just another piece of feedback at the end of the day on your athlete. But equally, it helps you paint the story or tell the story if you're using evidence over time to explore what's happened in that learning. So evidence can be really valuable at helping paint the picture of the story and give confidence then to, you know, how are you getting on with closing that gap, and what's been the learning. So evidence is a really, really interesting one, whatever form it takes.
Yeah, it can serve as your sort of memory for you, your sort of objective memory, and also gives you that objective piece of limited information that sometimes shocks you out of an assumption that was based on some kind of bias. And it can only work if, like Tom was saying earlier, if you're ready to be wrong, if you're ready to go, oh wow, we've just spent half an hour talking about this being the reason, and now we've seen this bit of disruptive data that comes along, and you're ready to change. I have seen occasions where people haven't been open to that new bit of information, so that tool gets thrown away at the same time as well.
What's been role model really well here, John, I think, is that sense of trust and intuition, that open vulnerability. I'm reminded of a call we did for the SCA the other week, where there is a sense from young coaches, young athletes, to really want the knowledge given to them. I think what's coming across really well on this call is, particularly from a slalom perspective, where my increase in knowledge lies, there's no one way or one type of doing things, and therefore there is no one answer. there is only intuition and the ability to guess right or guess wrong and be happy to sort of have an iterative process of progression from there. I want to just come to Sid's question because I think it's a timely point, which is he makes the point that for pathway athletes, they may not know what underpins a performance, and just reinforcing the role of the coach. I think we've talked about that. And I want to ask Jon a little bit more about that in a moment from his perspective through the pathway. But firstly, I guess, do we have any examples, gentlemen, of when we've guessed wrong and when we've guessed right that have had notable success? Maybe go to Mark to start.
Well, I'm sure there are loads. You put me on the spot there. I've certainly had it, in and around competition plenty of times, and I think of those decisions. They're around assumptions that you've made without asking the questions properly and giving it enough thought in the wider context. Quite often, with a longer term development of an athlete, or where are they at in this particular moment in time with these skills that they've got to execute. So quite often those judgments come from maybe the wrong assumptions at times, not having the full picture. That's without getting into slalom specifics. It's sort of a way of seeing it.
Brilliant. I can maybe offer one in that's come to mind for myself. So a few years back now, I probably was involved in encouraging an athlete to try and become more consistent, and our way of sort of identifying that gap and working on it was to offer more planning, more structure into the race preparation. What I learned, or what we learned in hindsight, that this was quite destabilizing for the athlete, and they felt quite roboticized, for want of a better word, in the performance themselves. And what we didn't consider enough was the person within the performance, because had we have done that, we realized where that person's strengths lies, in instinct, in adaptability, in free thinking. And what it's led to now as a positive, notable success following guessing wrong is that it stripped it right back, and now the planning phase for that particular athlete at that time is really quite what some people might view as quite loose, and has very little structure to it, considering the level of performance they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I've got a couple of examples on two different timescales. I guess I'd look at it. One would be kind of assessing potentially some gaps in performance throughout the competition rounds in sprint. Would be the number of times where we've made an assumption about a performance in terms of where were the better or worse elements in a race, and then we've got the kind of GPS trace of that performance, and the two haven't matched at all. That's a particularly common mistake because often the athletes' feedback's based on what they see around them. So and so is the coaches, i.e. seeing how people are racing around you is having more impact in your judgment of your performance than what's actually gone on. And that's a really hard one to tease away. And it's a great example of where you've got to be open to your perception, your feelings of what's going on, and potentially maybe why something's happened. But that objective tool in terms of the GPS race profiling is often quite valuable, particularly the less experienced the athlete is. And then that's something that you can use as a learning tool, is to start to bring those two bits of information together over time, and then you'll end up with athletes that are actually really close to the mark of their initial interpretation of the race. The other one is a much more long-term set of guesses, I guess, that we had. That was when we were starting the process of training for 200 meters, which came into the Olympic program for 2012. We started training for in the winter of 2009. Concerns the whole stroke rate to speed relationship. Initial years of that, we were probably looking for ways to push higher stroke rates, to lift that up, our ability to do it. We thought that actually it was your ability to rate, and that we're going to see certain numbers needed for certain performances over the years. We kind of pushed through various ways of looking and testing that, and through all the different streams of information that were coming in, it led us back towards essentially force production being more important than speed of movement to actual boat speed. So i.e. towards the last few years of training for 200 meters, our rates were actually dropping as our speeds were going up. So that initial guess was one of the ones that we made that turned out to be wrong. Fortunately, we were kind of open enough to that possibilities to see that it was and make that long-term change.
Thank you, Jon. Appreciate the open and honest insight there.
I've got a quick question for Mark, actually, in terms of, you mentioned reviewing a couple of times. How do you kind of get through the sense that emotion and your desire to be right immediately with how you assess a performance? How do you try and get through that so you're more often making an accurate judgment? I'm thinking particularly when it happens in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, the timing of review is really, really critical. And I think it's got to happen. There has got to be a quick review. I find that quite valuable, just the initial sort of dealing with it. You know, quite often if it's a mistake type review and there's emotion around it, I still think you've got to have that, even though you're not wanting to put too much accuracy to it at that moment in time. I think you've got to have that connection with the athlete at that time. That's part of the relationship side, that your ability to talk in those moments is quite important. But it's not using that to necessarily make conclusions and decisions around what's happened. And I think that the timing of how you go about and when that review process, quite important. You know, it's obviously season dependent on what's coming next a little bit, which is quite often why when you've got more time, you can go into that more thorough debrief. But if you're moving on to a race pretty quickly, and it might be only within the next few days that more thorough, you know, analysis of the performance takes place. But if you've got longer time, like after a world championship, something like that, when it's been such a big build-up, you probably need a longer time for it all to sink in, because you're taking in the context of the whole season's preparation, you know, everything that's been built up to that. So, you know, coming back to that at a later date with a fresh pair of eyes, less emotion involved with it, and having had the time to really look into independently the performance and then bring your collective, you know, discussion about it together. So yeah, it's an important point, really timely, in that you've got to deal with all bits of that review process over time to do it in the best way you can.
I'm reminded there, Mark, by that great example of the concept of like a hot debrief and a full debrief. And the hot one is often the one in the moment, which does carry emotion, which is important and does give a good understanding into the athlete and your dynamic. And whilst we are talking here about a longitudinal sort of perspective of performance gaps over time, I think we'd echo for the slalom coaches, particularly on the call, and I'm sure it resonates to sprint as well, that sense of between rounds in slalom, where you also have to identify performance gaps under time pressure with the hot debrief and then using the information available. Sid, I'm conscious of your question, and I think that's a key one. So Sid on the chat talks about, there's a lot of talk about gaps, and I guess some people could infer a negative connotation to the word gap in terms of maybe leading to thinking of a weakness or an area to improve. I guess, do you guys have any examples with individual athletes who may respond better to, I guess, a positive slant on using strengths to maximize rather than attending to gaps?
Well, Craig, I was going to, I had a point I jotted down earlier in the conversation, and it's reasonably well related to that, so I'll go with it. But it's just to start off, I think is a little bit of management speak, so excuse me. But I think in terms of, for a given area, I find it really useful to think about success permitting and success differentiating levels of a certain attribute. And so by what that I mean, and we often talk about it, is in buckets. Is say there's a bucket of technical skill, let's say. There's a certain level of technical skill you need to be at the races, kind of thing, just to be barely competitive. And then there's some which is halfway full up the bucket, let's say, and then the top of the bucket is is more. Is that's what differentiates you? So if you had a full bucket, you're the best in the world at something. That might be why you win. And understanding those levels for various attributes helps to understand why athletes are, I guess, are unique and different. So the athletes that win on the international stage or at any stage probably aren't the best at everything, but they're probably really good at some things and then good enough at other things that it doesn't cost them. And I guess it's the language that I know we use with your athletes, Craig, is around the super strengths and understanding how you make what's someone's best attributes and how do you make that more. And so I guess that is very much a way to put positive stance. And it's not necessarily a specific example, but as well as kind of filling the buckets up to the success permitting level, you can then also. Another strategy would be to try and overfill something that's particularly differentiating for you to really stand out in that way.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I can echo that. I think knowing the person in front of you is key, and how you use language, because a lot of coaching is about language. You can talk about the same thing in different ways by the language you use. And I think, whilst one person might respond to the concept of building on strengths, another person might see that as complacent, that you're not tending to areas that need gain. So I think it's really understanding the person and choosing your language very carefully and getting feedback on that. Jon, I said I'd come back to you, and I'm really keen to for the last 8 minutes or few, and then we'll come to you, Mark, to close. Guys, we need to appreciate, and we do, I know that we're really afforded great service support at the level we work at, with analysis, with teams around us that can really support and be often the engine room of this performance analysis process that allows us probably a greater information pool from which to decide upon, which obviously takes a skill to pick out the key bits. Jon, you've come through a pathway right from the start through program support, right through to an Olympic level, with a number of coaches, but obviously quite a long experience with a certain coach. I guess I'm keen to hear for your advice to coaches on the call, maybe working with development athletes. For those who don't have all that analysis available, and in the concepts you put forward of keeping it simple, what would be your advice for the interventions coaches can have relating to performance gaps analysis with athletes lower down the pathway?
Yeah, well, I guess it's a little bit less of an issue because the gaps are so much bigger. So that's one thing that immediately kind of negates part of the issue of having kind of less full and kind of sort of well-qualified service provision at your fingertips. I guess the main thing from my point of view, though, is just in terms of recording performance, all the simplest tools, bits of intuition, that they're all plenty at that level. So I would say if you've got a stopwatch and the ability to do time trials over a few different distances, for example, there you go. You've got a picture of an element of the skill set within that athlete. So you might, for example, know their overall performance on your race distances that you're talking about. You'll know their performance over 50 meters, 200 meters, and 5,000. Just from that, there's a wealth to come out. And then within that, imagine you might be doing some sessions, talking all sprint stuff now, but it might be 8 times 1,000 meters. You look at that, and you're again, all you're doing is taking the times. Your stopwatch is your only tool at the moment. But the first is always really fast, and the next 2 always drop down, and then it kind of varies around a bit, and then have a fast last one. That immediately tells you a lot about the kind of psychological approach of the athlete to training, and then you've got conversations off the back of that. So I kind of see, if you're curious, you're willing to make guesses and kind of engage with more than enough literature and resource that's available both online or through things like this, fortunately, and the ability to speak to other coaches. Don't know that many coaches that are worth speaking to that wouldn't want to. So I think making the use of being able to gather that information and help to do things the fact that you can use simple tools, and the fact that even if you don't have a lot of resource around you, you can still have good ideas and guesses. I don't see there's actually too much of an issue to implement this at all. Just quickly on Sid's point about potentially performance gaps being seen negatively, just want to make sure it got across the picture that I'm sure Tom and Mark would probably agree with, that this isn't something we're talking about day in, day out with the athletes. Their enjoyment, the things they're good at, are probably far more at the fore of what we're doing. You just see an athlete that's in a position where they can accept that they're not perfect. They've got to be able to accept that there's things to improve. But yes, absolutely, you got to be careful about overemphasizing those gaps and the negativity.
2 points there, John. Firstly, I think every slalom person on the call, at the prospect of putting an athlete through a range of 200 meter to 5,000 meter efforts, has probably fell off their chair. And I would agree on that in terms of your latter point. I think everything we're talking about now, the skill of how much to put this across to the athlete and when, is critical, and that can only come through a process of learning and understanding of the athlete themselves. Mark, going to come to you as we start to wrap up.
Yeah, just on that point John was making about gaps and not seeing that negatively. I've certainly had athletes that only want to hear where can I get better, that side of things. They're not interested in being told where they're good. But I think it's probably useful to think of it as comparison with themselves, rather than necessarily always off others, because then you've always got that barometer off yourself to look at improvement. That might be an easier way to think about it. But the challenge in development level is really tough. Like the time limit that you might have with an athlete to focus on a gap or an improvement, in the context, the environment you've got and the group that you're in, and I just echo the keeping it simple message, really. Just think about the fundamentals of the sport for the long term for that athlete always, and the relationship around how you want to communicate and motivate to get those changes over time. But I think the simple ways that you do that, really use video. I think for us, particularly in slalom, is essential as a skill-based sport to see what's happening and try and use that. If you haven't got any other complicated tools, the stopwatch, I remember Tom saying, Alex, working with you guys, you can go a long way with just a stopwatch, that's for sure, as a key marker of what's actually happening. But yeah, just echo, keeping it simple, really simple.
Mark, any final remarks from you, Tom?
No, I'll just completely echo Johnny's previous point around use the simple stuff. Unfortunately, there's no answers out there. There's no right way to do it. There's no magic measurement that's going to tell you what to do. The more you measure and the more you go into detail, the more complicated it gets and the more confusing it gets. So, just use simple things. Trust what you know about the sport. Almost all of the work I do is involving using a stopwatch or looking at how much weight is on a barbell, which anyone can do. So you don't need fancy measurement tools. You just need to keep it simple and think about it.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. That's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. The key take-homes for me, we heard at the start, it's a process grounded in learning. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. Guess right, use intuition. Points from John about one thing at a time. Keep it simple. Be mindful of compartmentalizing. Keep things coupled. Have the end in mind. What does the race look like? And where you can keep things coupled in terms of their relationship to each other while you look at specific elements of performance. Do that. And if you want any ideas around that, a future webinar, I'm sure we'll be looking into that. And then Mark's point, really, which we've honed in on at the end, which is crucial, that sense of for development athletes. And John says, in some ways it's easier because there's big performance gaps and they might be everywhere. But that concept of what and when, what's important now, and really having a knowledge from the coach's angle of the event, but also the person in making those decisions. And that may be the environment they situate themselves in, and the affordances of that in terms of, for a slalom perspective, their ability to train on white water, access a gym, those sort of things. And in the words of Anna in Frozen 2, for all the dads out there to close, do the next right thing. I'm going to look forward to next week. We've got Gareth Wilson in the chair. I'm having a break. I've got a commitment with UK Sport next week. So firstly, thank you very much to the panel and everyone in the room today. I've thoroughly enjoyed that. That is our biggest attendance. I can't speak for them. I don't know if that's a reflection of the quality here or the highbrow nature of the panel. Next week, Gaz Wilson back from paternity leave. I know he's on the call. Hi, Gareth. Congratulations. We've got Dr. Phil Kearney in from Limerick University. And we'll be getting an insight into his applied research in optimal environments for junior development. And we're building a panel around that to see how that relates in context to paddle sport. So the research link into the context of paddle sport around optimal learning environments for junior development. Thank you very much. This will go up in the next 48 hours on our YouTube channel and on the digital library from British Canoeing. So in the meantime, stay safe, and we'll see you with Gareth next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.
Nice.